We don't really know China's capabilities to the full extent, mainly because they don't tend to publish them. I mean, one of the good parts about living in a democracy is that if we create something like the littoral combat ship and it doesn't work, everybody knows about it. Whereas in Russia, perhaps even in China, that would be covered up.
Hello, culminators. A little bit something different today. I want to have a chat, and we're going to have a chat because I convinced him that we should have a chat with one of my favorite YouTubers, and really to call him a YouTuber is rather an insult. He's a much more happening guy than that. Ryan McBeth is an intelligence analyst, software architect, cybersecurity guy, also a YouTube content creator on military intelligence and disinformation topics. You can find him on Newsmax. He's got a great YouTube channel. He also works for the Texas Aero Med Lab, University of Texas at Dallas, as the director of integration. Can you imagine it's still not integrated in Texas? He is the real deal. He spent 20 years as an anti-armor and heavy weapons infantryman, and he travels all over the damn place. Oh, and also, like everybody but Ron Coleman, he writes fiction. And he's now inviting the public. By the time you see this, I am sure the decision will have been made. But he's got a new book, The Last Republic, and he is selecting book covers, all of them striking me as equally earth-shattering. This is a busy mind. Ryan, welcome to the show. Thanks so much for spending a little bit of time with us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Last thing I saw, you were in Romania.
Yeah.
Or was Poland
right.
after Romania?
Yeah, I was in Poland and then Romania, well, France, Poland, and then Romania. Essentially, the NATO asked me to come out to Poland after there was some comments were made by the Secretary of Defense, and so I kind of went out to NATO and I did some social media and I kind of developed some strategies with them that they could use to perhaps enhance NATO's image in Europe and just kind of let the public know what NATO's all about.
Is this cool? Does this guy have a cool job or what? Now, so Ryan, I'm an old Cold Warrior. I went to college in the 80s. One of the things I wanted to talk to you about, because even though when I first approached you, you said, well, I'm really a weapons and tactics guy, and I'm not a politics guy as such. But of course, the space between the tactics and strategy is demonstrated to be flexible by the fact that you were on this trip. And of course, politics and strategy feed off each other and distort each other tremendously. So in the Cold War days, fine, we had this identified adversary, and I really enjoyed your video, in fact, which I just tweeted this morning, about why the terminology and the concept of the military-industrial complex is not relevant in the 21st century. With all due respect to Ike, it made sense then, but it doesn't make sense now. And I urge people to take a look at that. When the adversary was essentially gone,
Yeah.
we moved to this world where we were the only hegemon.
Yeah. Yes, you're correct.
And that seemed to really bother Barack Obama. That was something that he couldn't live with. But in the conservative movement, which I'm not identifying you with, but I'm identified with, there seems to be a misunderstanding among that if you're that the world is divided into the conservative world, so to speak, or the Republican world is divided into neocons who are warmongers and America firsters who aren't isolationists, but sound very much like isolationists. But as someone who came up and who studied international affairs a little bit in college, I remember there was this idea that you could be a hegemon, which means you don't have to rule the world or create an empire. you can just be strong enough to do whatever the hell you want in areas that are essential to you or that matter to you, and that isn't necessarily warmongering. Where are we now? What do you think?
I don't entirely know. I know that one of America's major concerns is China, and we need to start pivoting to China. Now, I can tell you that for ever since Obama, we have said to Europe, you guys need to start stepping up. And Europe just kind of went, America's always going to be there. We're always going to have America protecting us. And that isn't the case anymore. And with our pivot to China, really
any more starting where? Any more when you say that, you mean effective January of this year? Or
well, I mean, we've been pivoting to China before that, essentially since 2022. The United States, for almost over 20 years, the United States is focusing on COIN, or counterinsurgency operations. And 2022 kind of saw the pivot back to LSCO, or large-scale combat operations. And that is a skill that we have let atrophy because of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now,
and also, I think I think also that was the part of the tail end of the Vietnam complex.
Yeah, you could say that. I mean, Vietnam was it was certainly a coin fight in the sense, oh, we're winning hearts and minds. Let's build this village a well. Let's get these Montagnards together and form a militia. There was certainly a level of that during Vietnam, but the level of bombing that we engaged against Hanoi, I mean, that was certainly LSCO. So I would certainly call Vietnam like a hybrid LSCO and coin fight.
I mean, Vietnam might be sort of the international affairs example of you can't learn anything from Hitler, and you can't learn we might have learned a million things from Vietnam, but it was such a complex hybrid of an engagement that it's a mistake to be facile about what you learn from it.
Yeah, that sounds about right. You're absolutely correct. Yeah.
So you're saying that there's been a pivot away from the counterinsurgency. Was the pivot because of the realization that China was more of a threat, or was it because we realized that we're never going to really be able to be great at counterinsurgency, or combination of both?
No, the pivot was mainly because China is becoming a threat. China, President Xi Jinping said that the PLA must be ready by 2027 to retake Taiwan. They must be ready. He's given that goal to his military. Now, as to whether or not they're able to accomplish that by 2027 is up for debate, but they have already started building some of the landing ships, these things called jack ships. And these are essentially these ferries that will kind of almost like oil platforms. So think of them like oil platforms with a large road that can kind of swing out and down. And if you look at Taiwan, their entire country really only has like 3 landing beaches. So it's not very conducive. I've often said Taiwan is like Vietnam and Afghanistan had a baby. Right? It's very mountainous, at least in the east. And there aren't a lot of beaches in the West. So China's plan here is to float these jack ships over to the East Coast, drop these pylons in the water, which allows the jack ships to kind of stand up in shallow water. It's kind of like an oil rig, and then drop this ramp, and then the tanks roll off, and then more ferries come over, and they send the tanks out. In China, all ferries are kind of required to carry the weight of tanks. So they might be regular plain old ferries that are shuttling people back and forth, but they have this dual use capability where they can be leased by the government and used as transports for tanks. So China's already started this. It's
sort of like the federal highway program in the 50s with the clearances and the weight tolerances, so that this imagined invasion of the United States.
Yeah.
We could move assets from California to New York on the highway. So, we, and yet politically, all this attention is paid to Russia and to Ukraine. You did a video, gosh, only a couple of days ago, why some celebrities support Russia, and celebrities, mostly conservative celebrities, but there's this idea that it's Ukraine or Russia, which is obviously fallacious, because you don't have to agree that Ukraine is an enlightened democracy to agree that Putin started the war in Russia. You also don't have to agree that, well, whatever the obverse of that would be. Trump comes in. He wants to be more assertive. His politics are more amenable to a hegemonic assertiveness than Biden's were. How did you feel, again, as an observer, no inside information requested here, but did the Biden years set us back? Did the Biden years, were we running in place in terms of readiness, in terms of, meeting defense goals?
In some ways, yes. In some ways, no. There have been some defense goals that haven't been met. Some of that is recruitment, and some of that is also procurement of major end weapon systems. But on the other hand, some other weapon systems have come online. And when it comes to Russia, one of the things that President Biden did was he gave Ukraine just enough to lose. And Ukraine was thankful for those weapon systems, and they used those weapon systems to great effect. But one of the things that President Biden never did was he never got on TV and said, listen, we need to support Ukraine because next is the Balkans, or the Baltics, and after the Baltics is Poland. Now, Poland might have something to say about that, but Russia literally has to capture Ukraine, because then Russia itself is essentially indefensible. They've always relied on General Winter. They've always relied on the fact that Winter will destroy any soldiers who are attacking Russia. But one of the reasons they had the Warsaw Pact, they had these buffer zones, was that countries like Ukraine had Carpathian Mountains. Can't really invade through that. So if they take Ukraine, and then they take the Baltics, and then they take Poland, well, now they've taken a 1,600-mile border and they've shrunk it down to 250-mile border. Now, because Poland has the mountains in the south, I forget what they're called, not the Alps, but it'll come to me. So essentially, they have to complete this. They have to.
Russia has to.
Russia has to complete this plan. That is their end state. That has always been their end state.
You believe that the acquisition, or what we might really more accurately call the reacquisition of Poland, is central to Putin's plan?
Yeah, it has to be. It has to be. That's the way they have to go in order to establish what they consider a safe zone.
And as you point out, Poland is obviously going to have something to say about that. And now that Poland is a NATO member, so do
the Baltics are NATO members as well. But don't forget, the whole reason behind misinformation is to spread fear. And just because Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia are NATO members, Article 5 of NATO, which says an attack on one is an attack on all, isn't necessarily a sword, in the sense that the second you invade a NATO country, every country activates their military and goes to fight. Kind of the rule here is that you do what is practicable for your country. So I've often likened it to a birthday party. You get an invitation to a birthday party, you might come to the birthday party, or you might Venmo $20. and that is the reality. that just because an attack on one is an attack on all doesn't mean every single country is going to send troops. Could be that some countries send cyber support, some countries send logistical support, and so on. So just because someone is a member of NATO doesn't make it an immediate shield against invasion. It's certainly a deterrence,
But
but
your point was, the way you phrased it at first was that it's not a sword, and that makes me think that what your point was is that
it's a
this
shield, not a sword.
it is a shield, not a sword, and but there's always this argument that, well, if the shield's good enough, it essentially begins to act like a sword. That because the narrative on in certain pockets of the right is, of course, Putin had to attack Ukraine because he's feeling threatened by NATO. You can only argue defensive alliance, defensive alliance, defensive alliance so much until you reach a point where it begins to sound like a rationalization for some other kind of alliance, even though any familiarity with either history or the politics of European countries. What's the scenario? They're going to invade Russia? I mean, that's insane.
Yeah.
What's the political genesis of such it's just impossible to posit.
Yeah, the United States is not going to invade Russia, and Russia was making plenty of money selling cheap oil and gas to Western Europe. So, when you kind of think about it, the odds of NATO ever invading Russia just for the lulls, that isn't
So
going to happen.
so then what is it that would be pushing Putin when you say that he has to get Ukraine and he has to work his way through the Baltics and eventually to Poland? Why does he have to? If there isn't a real threat from the West, what is it? What's that? Is it a psychological imperative?
It's certainly a psychological imperative. It also, when you're running Russia, you
As
have
one
this
does.
you have this issue. There are people, I mean, I knew a woman who she was a Russian journalist, and then she left Russia and she went to Ukraine and worked as a journalist in Ukraine. And now she lives here in the US and works as a journalist here. And what is interesting is that there are a lot of people in Russia who are relatives in Ukraine and vice versa. It was one country at one point. And kind of when you have relatives who live in a freer society, and Ukraine wasn't it's not the Jeffersonian democracy that you consider the United States, but it is freer than Russia. And when you have people who are in Ukraine and they're kind of leaning west and they like the idea of the freedoms in the West, or maybe they want to join the EU, Russia might take a look at that and consider it a threat because your relatives in Russia might call back to your relatives in Ukraine, and your relatives in Ukraine talk about what a great life they have. And now you kind of wonder, well, what's my government doing for me?
And Russia has a brain drain problem.
Almost certainly. Almost certainly. I can tell you that Russian software programmers tend to be very, very good at what they do. And a lot of them would love to come to America and work for American software companies because that's where they can make their money, right? In American software companies. And when you're not motivated to stay in Russia. I think doctors get paid like $120 a month. It's just not a tenable situation. I've often said Russia is a mafia-run gas station, essentially. Right? They take stuff out of the ground and they sell it to other people. And pretty much if you look at any country whose main business is taking stuff out of the ground and selling it to other people, those countries tend to be authoritarian.
And they used to be able to at least sell arms and munitions.
Yeah, that's going to
That
be a lot
business.
tougher now.
Yeah.
It's going to be a lot tougher. Um,
Especially because when you have this entire changeover to American or Western weapons, even if everything comes up rainbows and lollipops in 3 months and everyone shakes hands and makes people are not going to turn back to Russian weapons, and they also haven't necessarily been all that impressed with the performance in Ukraine of Russian technology.
You're absolutely correct. And that's one of the reasons looking at the F-35 as an option. You know, when you have when you're a democracy like India, you're a member of their parliament. I can't remember what their parliament is called, but you can get unelected, right? So if you vote for procurement of a Russian jet fighter, the opposition party that you're going to have to run against next year might say, look at this politician. Our soldiers, our airmen deserve the best equipment, and they voted for Russian equipment, and we see how that turned out in Ukraine. So it's going to be very difficult for Russia to sell arms to people who might want to use these things, especially in democracies or pseudo democracies. Your average dictator in Africa probably doesn't care that much, especially if you're fighting people who can't shoot back for the most part. But that's certainly a factor.
Now, I see a lot of going back to the other pole, which is China.
Mhm.
They one thing that I see on fairly consistently, and as you know, some of the military and defense oriented videos are silly. You know, they tend to be a little bit over the top, but there does seem to be some consensus that China is really commie style addicted to overstating the capability of their weapon systems. We should be grateful for this, but they don't. One thing about the American military is that if it's had a great deal of practice, for better or for worse, it has stayed limber. There were obviously major mistakes in terms of weapons acquisition and planning. When you got this much money, I guess it's just going to happen. The littoral combat ships, for example, but the Chinese really don't know. I mean, they don't know even if there's fuel in their ballistic missiles.
Yeah, well, so you kind of have to take that with a grain of salt. We really don't know. Um, you know that what you want to avoid is wishful thinking, right?
Right.
Because it's very easy to point at China and go, "Ha ha, they filled up their missiles with water," right? I guarantee you that anybody, if that is true, anybody who did that is probably dead now.
Oh, sure.
And so there is certainly an incentive to get things right in a country like China. Maybe Russia, not so much. Corruption is a thing in Russia, and there's always been this low level of corruption, blat. You know, this they call it this kind of low level. Wash my hand, I'll wash yours. Scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. I don't know if that exists in China, especially with a government that is so, I don't want to say fanatical, but they've established a level of authoritarian cult of personality where if Xi says you should read this book, all of his ministers immediately talk about how great this book is and they suggest to their underlings to read it. And that suggestion isn't a suggestion.
In other words, it's still largely a Stalinist kind of model in
You could
terms
say
of
that it's this weird
personality.
hybrid of capitalism and authoritarianism, right? Production directed by authoritarianism, but with pockets of capitalism where you can make money.
So, in other words, the classic military error of despising your adversary would be particularly poorly advised with an adversary as large and wealthy as China.
I wouldn't count them out. And I remember back when people were saying, "Oh, look at this footage from Putin. It looks like he's holding onto the table. He has Parkinson's disease." And that's a level of wishful thinking
Sure.
that look, people get Parkinson's disease all the time, and I assume there's treatments for it. I've never really looked this up. I assume you can get treated for Parkinson's disease. I don't think that really affects your mind, perhaps. But I mean, look, FDR had polio and he won Second World War. A guy couldn't even freaking walk, right? So just because you have some kind of physical disability doesn't necessarily mean that you're not an effective leader. Now, whether Putin has Parkinson's disease or not is really irrelevant to the whole conversation. What's relevant is that he's still in power, and people are afraid of usurping that power. I mean, look what happened to Yevgeny Prigozhin, the leader of Wagner. He tried his little coup against Russia. He decided to stop, and then one day his plane blows up.
As
So
as
I
they do.
wouldn't. Yeah, the Chinese missile thing. We don't really know China's capabilities to the full extent, mainly because they don't tend to publish them. I mean, one of the good parts about living in a democracy is that if we create something like the littoral combat ship and it doesn't work, everybody knows about it. Whereas in Russia, perhaps even in China, that would be covered up.
So that
So,
actually that makes a decent segue to
yeah.
back to the home front. We've got a culture shift going on at the Pentagon and in the defense world, where to some extent this really phenomenal moment of, I mean, we're talking of just a few days after the Joint Chiefs of Staff were essentially decapitated in this country. And, friends of mine on X, like, Cynical Publius and Kurt Schlichter, you know, what I pick up from guys who are retired colonels is just how little regard they have for four-star generals. And we seem to be in the dawn of the generals kind of moment, which is an amazing thing to see happening in American public life. Are you familiar with? I mean, what are your thoughts on Peter Hegseth?
I think we have a guy who is trying to do the right thing. His main focus is on lethality, which is certainly necessary. I also think that one of his main concerns is that our military is too woke. And I can tell you that I've embedded with the military. I once went to a Pride Night celebration on the USS Eisenhower, and honestly, I think people were mainly there for the cake. Yeah, it's nobody really cares. It's one of the neat things about the military. Nobody gives a darn if you're gay or straight or what religion you are. If you work, if you're a good soldier, a good sailor, nobody cares, and we all make fun of each other. That's just par for the course. We all make fun of each other. But at the end of the day, we're kind of all in it together, and nobody really cares. I've talked about how there were guys in my unit who were Latter-day Saints, who were Mormons, and they were great because they would be our designated drivers when we went out drinking. Like people say, one of the things that I believe Secretary Hegseth said is that diversity isn't our strength. Well, tell that to a Navajo code talker, right?
Right,
During
but
World War II, the U.S. Marines needed a way to communicate with each other through coded messages, and Navajo is a language that isn't written down. So the Navajo code talkers would embed with the Marine Corps and send messages to each other, Waliwaken, which means submarine. Well, the Japanese didn't know what the heck they were hearing, right? Well, only we can do that. And it's because we have Navajos. If we needed to launch a special operation against China, I guarantee we can find second generation ethnically Chinese soldiers in our military, and we can put together a team. And that's not necessarily something that China can do.
that's where you need code talkers and where you need Chinese understanding. You know the story during in these. I think it was in '48
Mhm.
or maybe it was in 56 when the Israelis realized that the probably Russian advisors understood the Hebrew radio transmissions. And this is the first generation of Israelis who are mostly Ashkenazim. They started speaking Yiddish to each other.
Ah, that's real. I haven't heard that, but I believe it.
Of course, if they would have had a few more Germans in Egypt, they would have probably been able to figure that out. But that's, I hear your point on that aspect of diversity, but the, you know, the controversial memorandum from General Brown, right? We need more diversity in recruiting, and we need to promote diversity. That's a little bit different, all right? In other words, that's not saying we need to have strength through diversity so that we have all the components for lethality or for effectiveness. It is, if there are 5 candidates for a slot, we're going to promote someone other than on the merits for diversity purposes. Your observation, based on your time embedded with U.S. troops, is that you didn't see anything that would make you believe that DEI has had or wokeness have had an effect on effectiveness.
I can only speak to the Army, but I know that, in the Army you get a certain number of points. Your points for the rifle score, your points for your physical fitness. Have you taken any college courses? Have you taken any correspondence courses? Did you go to the schools? How well did you do in the schools? So for the most part, at least the Army is colorblind. Now, at certain levels, you do have to take a DA picture. So that's a Department of the Army photo. And someone might be able to tell your race from the Department of the Army photo. But for the most part, at least at lower levels, your promotion goes by, did you meet the standards? Have you gone to the schools? And so it's totally colorblind in that sense. Now, I'm unfamiliar with how other services have done it, and I am aware that there have been incidents where there have been people who have pushed for soldiers, specifically females, who aren't not able to accomplish certain tasks. They've been pushing for those soldiers to be graduated from schools, even though they can't necessarily meet the standards. I know that has happened at the armor school at Fort Benning, previously Fort Benning, now called Fort Moore, that some female trainees were pushed through, even though they didn't have the strength to cock a 50 caliber machine gun. Um, and in cases like that, that's a problem. That is certainly a problem. There needs to be certain gender neutral standards. But other branches of the military may have their own ways of promoting people that I'm just not familiar with and I couldn't speak to.
So, and you might not be able to speak to this either, but one of the big narratives in on the right is, and I hear it a lot from other guys that I interview, is that Obama did his own sort of decapitation, or really took out of, removed from leadership and potential leadership positions people who he did not believe were going to run with a woke agenda in the military. Uh, does that, I mean, when did you leave active service?
Oh God, 2014.
So you were there for part of the Obama era,
20 years, yeah.
but you were an enlisted man.
Correct.
So the politics stuff doesn't necessarily, while you're in the service, filter down to you. But obviously, given the nature of the work that you've done since then, would you agree that Obama did political stuff with the
Well, we all
military?
do political stuff. I mean,
That's a
people have
political
asked
job.
me to make videos about the higher ranking four-star generals who were fired. And look, they serve at the pleasure of the president. It is the president's prerogative to remove certain generals. And that's just the way it is. And any officer knows that. So if you are of an opinion that the president doesn't agree with, he is within his rights to replace you, whether it's President Obama or President Trump. And that's just the reality of the situation.
All right, but give that what everything you're saying undebatable, but wouldn't you do you then disagree with the idea that Obama did so in a, not like Truman removing MacArthur? There's a policy disagreement
Yeah.
between two top guys, but that there was a studied plan to get rid of certain more, maybe they were politically unappealing to the Obama administration, or to remove people so that people who were more like Obama thinking politically and in terms of
Yeah.
DEI and in terms of same sex, there was a lot of transition that took place that's no longer taking place in terms, when we went from Bill Clinton, don't ask, don't tell.
Yeah.
We've come a very long way since then.
That's a very good question. And I, unfortunately, at the time,
Yeah,
I didn't really pay attention to any of that stuff. So I couldn't really give you an answer. I know that for us, things like equal opportunity training or diversity training, it was a slideshow that was done once, usually in January. And then you check the box, and the first sergeant's red cell is now green. And everybody got their diversity training. Let's move on. And
so
that's just kind of like you don't really analyze it all that much. You just kind of do as you're told to do. All right, we got to do this. And everybody listens and they nod, and some people are asleep in the back. Everybody signed the sheet that you watched the video, and then you go on to the next block of instruction, which is how to appropriately use a travel card. So I'm serious. Like,
so, so looking at snapshot, we're 2 months into this Trump business. Do you think the changes that he's trying to make at the Pentagon are going to be good ones? Do any of them sound like loony to you?
well, I can tell you that it's good to refocus on lethality. It's good to refocus on China. Um,
When we say we're refocusing on lethality, what does that mean we were focused on before?
no, we were still focused on lethality before, but I
Breaking things
believe
and
that,
killing people.
yeah, breaking things and killing people. But to refocus on the Lisco side of the house as opposed to the coin side of the house, because don't get me wrong, we are still lethal, but there are soldiers who have never constructed a two-man fighting position. Why have they never constructed a two-man fighting position? Well, because when they got in, it was in 2010 or 2008, and they're doing convoy live fires, right? So we might not necessarily need convoy live fires in the next war.
Because that's more insurgent oriented.
Correct. So that refocus on lethality is necessary because we're just we still have the coin mindset. All these soldiers who are in Iraq and Afghanistan. If you were a lieutenant in Iraq or Afghanistan, you're now a battalion commander, brigade commander now. And you need to start thinking about things differently. We need to start thinking about drones. We need to start thinking about masking in multiple spectrums. That's another big thing, masking in multiple spectrums. And that's all necessary because the next war is not going to look like Iraq or Afghanistan. Might not even look like Ukraine. That's another big thing. I've said that drones, we might see the rise and fall of drone warfare in Ukraine.
In other
And
words, countermeasures are becoming so sophisticated that
correct.
it might end up being the what would be the best analogy? The battleship of
Well, the sword and the spear, right? The first dude who picked up a stick and said, I'm going to poke you with this until you do what I tell you to do, That was a pretty darn lethal weapon. Spear was probably the first weapon, right? Found a stick on the ground. Let me sharpen this. I'm going to poke Thag because I don't like the way Thag looks at my girl, right? But then when someone created a shield, well, that was a countermeasure. It doesn't necessarily make the stick less lethal, but you need to adapt tactics. So I think by the end of the war in Ukraine, we're still going to have drones, but we're going to have certain kind of adaptations which will require that we change tactics.
Now, do you come from a military family?
My dad was in the Air Force. He joined the Air Force because he was about to get drafted into the Army. But I wouldn't call myself a military family. No, not really.
So it is one of the things that people are talking about is whatever it is that Trump means politically and symbolically to the military sector or cadre or whatever you want to call it. Could not, I don't only mean the Defense Department, but also the way people think about defense. Uh, he seems to have had a salutary effect on recruiting. Have, have you picked up any of that scuttlebutt?
It certainly seems the case that the recruiting numbers have been going up. That could be a Trump effect. That could also be the effect that there is inflation right now. And one of the ways of making sure you have a steady job, steady paycheck, and good medical care is you join the military. So until we actually poll these soldiers as to why they decided to join now, it could be any number of reasons. It could also be cyclical as well.
I'm going to ask you one more topic, and that's the conflict in Israel and the surrounding lands and territories and all that business. And I'm not going to get political at all. Rather, what I'm going to ask you is, does the Israeli military have anything to teach the United States military, and has it done so?
Absolutely. So, one of the things that the Israeli military has taught the United States is that the F-35, because they've been riding those F-35Is hard and putting them away wet. And they've taught the United States that the F-35
You have to explain the meaning of that
ride hard and put away wet. All right. Well, when you
riding
ride a
hard, I get.
horse, when you ride a horse, the horse will sweat. And if you put the horse away wet, it means you didn't dry the horse off first. So
You gave it a good
essentially,
workout.
they have been working out that F-35 to the point where we now know that it
It
is a
works.
very efficient and effective platform.
And boy,
Uh,
that was a weapon that was really maligned for a long time.
so that's kind of the deal with a lot of U.S. weapons, and it's because we are an open society. People can question things, and a lot of reports are put up online because it's our money. And when people criticize a program like the F-35, they might criticize it on cost reasons or that it doesn't work. And a lot of new tech doesn't work, but just about every weapon system I can think of, except maybe the M1 tank, and people complained about the M1 tank because there was no bottom hatch in it, so you couldn't pee while you're inside the tank. Um, you know, probably you look at the Bradley, people criticize the Bradley. And you look at the first Gulf War and you look at the Bradley's performance in Ukraine, and it is an incredible weapon system. You look at weapons like, even the littoral combat ship. We've given the littoral combat ship the Hellfire missile. We've also given it containerized SM-6s. So these are naval missiles that can be fired from shipping containers that are bolted onto the helicopter deck of the littoral combat ship. So, sometimes when we create a piece of tech, the reason our weapon systems are so good is that we do kind of push the boundaries and see what we can do. And in the end, we develop these weapon systems that are light years beyond the capability of our adversaries, but there are teething problems until that happens.
So Israel, you were saying, so you mentioned the F-36, the
Oh,
F-35.
F-35, missile defense. We've watched Israel destroy weapon systems in space, and that has certainly helped. We've learned how they've done close-in weapons, close-in missile defense, especially with Iron Dome. I believe we bought 2 Iron Dome systems to test. So we've really, and also we've learned how Israel uses AI when it comes to targeting. They have made mistakes, but because they've made those mistakes, we've been able to take a look at those mistakes and we can learn from those mistakes so we don't make the same mistakes when we start using AI to
Channel
target.
communication between the two countries' militaries, pretty
Oh yeah,
cooperative.
we have people over there. We
But
have
but
people over there learning.
but the USS Liberty,
What about it?
anti-Semites will drop that into any thread involving Israel. So
Oh, I haven't. I tend to stay away from a lot of naval topics because I'm really not that
no, I get
familiar
it.
with it.
Listen,
I
listen,
kind of
I
know
got
what happened, but I never really looked into it
it
because
was unpleasant and it was also over 50 years ago. You know,
yeah, I once in a while I have people, what about the USS Liberty? And I'm like, oh, is that ship that was attacked by accident or something? I'm not
wasn't an
entirely
accident.
familiar
The
with it, and
Rothschilds told him to do it. Okay, I told you I wouldn't get you into politics.
I
Ryan, you've been a really
unfortunately,
good sport. I've taken you all over the place. I really do enjoy your programming, and I learned so much from you. Guys like you and Cappy, regular guys that everyone can relate to, who really are great at explaining things. You have this, really esoteric uh, background, and you're still you feel like you're on the side of the angels.
I certainly hope so, and I certainly think we're the good guys, and
That's a big deal.
I would say that I like being one of the good guys.
Well, thank you very much. You've been a good guest as well.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me on.
My pleasure. Nice meeting you, and keep up the good work. Catch you
Thank you.
later.